Welcome to Animals Matter. I'm Alyssa Weaver, your host for today's program. Animals Matter covers a variety of current issues affecting pets, livestock, wildlife, and other animals. The program is sponsored by the Southern Oregon Animal Rights Society, or SOARS, a nonprofit organization which seeks to inform and inspire people to adopt a humane lifestyle. Our topic today will address human and wildlife conflicts, mostly involving predators. We have Scott Beckstead here with us in the studio today. We'll also be showing a short documentary from a group called Predator Defense, and we'll hear about local efforts to address conflicts with predators in a more humane way. I'll start by introducing Scott Beckstead. He's the Senior Oregon Director and Rural Outreach Director of the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS. In addition to his work with HSUS, Scott holds a law degree from the University of Utah and teaches animal law classes at Willamette University. Welcome, Scott. I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you for joining us down in Southern Oregon and sharing your expertise on this issue with us.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored.
Appreciate it. Conflicts with wildlife have occurred since man has had to coexist with animals, since man has stopped being nomadic and settled. And early in our country's history, predators were feared and pretty much just viewed in a black and white perspective where they needed to be eradicated in favor of hunting and ranching interests. Can you speak a little bit to that history and how contemporary society now realizes the importance of predators in a natural ecosystem?
Sure. Well, as you correctly identified, the history of the settlement of the United States involves really a war on wild predators, and many species were almost completely exterminated from the landscape, particularly of the western United States. Wolves were largely removed from most of their historic range, grizzly bears, mountain lions or cougars. So they were viewed, as you said, really as vermin to be exterminated. And then I think beginning with the environmental movement, people started recognizing that wild predators fill a very valuable niche, a very valuable role in the natural environment. And so there has been a shift away from regarding predators as unwanted vermin to be exterminated to really be valued as part of the larger ecosystem and members of the natural community. And so that's an evolution that, of course, the Humane Society of the United States wants to promote and encourage. And so as a fan of wild predators, I'm always happy to have conversations like this.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, I know that in the late 1800s, our government in our country established, I'm going to call it an agency, it was a program, and I think it was called Animal Damage Control. It was later renamed to be Wildlife Services. Wildlife Services, as I understand it, is still active in mostly the western states and certainly here in Oregon. It is promulgated through contracts with specific individual counties. I know that the Humane Society of the United States, Predator Defense, the Center for Biological Diversity, as well as many other environmental and humane organizations take issue with how Wildlife Services has been, their methods, the secretive way in which they operate, and has found that a lot of their methods are unscientific and also inhumane. So I know HSUS has taken a stand against Wildlife Services. Can you talk to us, please, about HSUS's reforms that they'd like to see Wildlife Services incorporate?
Sure. Well, yes, and Wildlife Services is what I refer to as a rogue federal agency. They are an agency that is completely lacking in transparency. They largely try and avoid accountability both to members of Congress as well as the American people. And historically they have existed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to kill wild animals, millions every year. And largely at the behest of local governments, state governments, but also private enterprises. Here in Oregon, for example, Wildlife Services traps and kills hundreds of black bears every year at the behest of timber companies. And that's a fact that a lot of Oregonians aren't aware of. But It's an organization that I think more people are becoming aware of because of how they operate. They have historically cultivated an internal culture of deliberate animal cruelty, and done everything they can to try and hide that culture from the taxpayers, and hide from the taxpayers exactly what they're doing in terms of the number of animals they're killing, including animals that they don't necessarily mean to kill but accidentally do, like pets and endangered animals.
Collateral
and things like
damage.
That. Correct. Yes.
Okay. Well, so is it HSUS's position then that really Wildlife Services should just be disbanded completely?
I think we would like to see the federal government take an approach to resolving human-wildlife conflicts in a manner that is humane and respectful. And right now, that is largely not happening with Wildlife Services. So I've not heard anyone at HSUS say that they should be completely eliminated, but certainly there needs to be some very basic fundamental reform about how this agency views wildlife and views the taxpayers. Until they do that, we will continue to be pushing for reforms.
That's great. Now, it's the USDA that administers this program, or they're under an arm of the USDA?
Yes,
Okay.
The USDA has jurisdiction over the Wildlife Services.
Now, there's some individual counties, I know Marin County in California, and then here locally, Lane County in Oregon, that have chosen to terminate their contracts with Wildlife Services and have gone to some non-lethal approaches to predator control, and have actually, from my understanding, found those approaches to be more effective and less costly. Can you speak to that?
Yes, and the approach that these counties are taking is one that we fully support. And unfortunately, most counties still have contracts with Wildlife Services, and I think that the growing concern on the part of counties, and you've listed 2 counties that have discontinued their relationship with Wildlife Services, is really a product of growing awareness about how this agency works, growing awareness about the fundamentally cruel and inhumane way that they approach wildlife conflicts. And so what we and many other groups and individuals who appreciate wildlife for its own sake are trying to do is encourage counties and other governmental entities to adopt an approach for dealing with wildlife that is humane, respectful, and that emphasizes non-lethal deterrence and taking steps to avoid the conflicts to begin with, rather than bringing in a federal agency to just kill these wild creatures.
And I know on the HSUS website there is a reference to Wild Neighborhoods program. Yes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We have a fantastic team of wildlife experts who work very closely with communities and local governments across the United States to encourage them to take an approach toward wildlife that really views wildlife as an important and very much wanted piece of the natural landscape, including the urban landscape. So, for example, dealing with coyotes in a way that that doesn't involve setting out traps, but instead focuses on getting people to make sure they bring pet food in, for example, and other attractants, whether it be coyotes or whether it be deer or whatever. There are things that local governments can encourage people to do that are far more effective at minimizing these conflicts than bringing in traps and snares and things like that.
Right, just education proactively on the front end that can really probably avoid a
right.
lot of, yeah.
That's a big part of it. For example, here in Ashland, there's a lot of deer that live in Ashland, and one of the things that the city of Ashland could do is pass a law that says that you can't put out feed or foodstuffs to attract these deer into your backyard. There are certain plants, shrubs, and ornamental bushes and things that you can plant that are actually a deterrent to deer. Just doing things like that, rather than creating an open season within city limits for these animals, many of whom people have really come to love and cherish as part of the city and what they see in the community.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about the legislature. I know that in Oregon right now there is a bill pending that would shorten trap checking time periods.
Right.
Tell me about that, and also, would that affect Wildlife Services because they're a governmental, pseudo-governmental entity?
Yes, Senate Bill 6 is a bill that's currently pending before the legislature. It's probably too early to say what the chances are that the bill will actually get passed, but Oregon has some of the most lax and outdated and confusing wildlife trapping regulations in the nation. At least 30 other states require trappers to check their traps at least every 24 hours. And depending on what you're setting a trap for in Oregon, you don't have to check your trap for anywhere from 48 hours to 30 days, or if your Wildlife Service is setting wire snares for black bears at the behest of timber companies, you never have to check those traps. So it's horrible enough to imagine what it must be like to be one of these creatures stuck in a steel-jawed leg-hold trap for 24 hours. But if you can imagine what they endure days on end, you know, dying from loss of blood, dehydration, exposure, starvation, or being killed and eaten by another animal. It's unacceptable. It's completely at odds with Oregon's humane values, and you know, that trapping reform is something that is badly needed here in Oregon. And again, I don't know if this bill is what's going to do it, but certainly there are a growing number of Oregonians who are deeply concerned about traps, especially on public lands, and it's something that we will continue fighting for.
And it addresses the issue in some way.
It does address the issue in some way, and it does apply to Wildlife Services.
Okay.
So Wildlife Services,
They would not be exempt.
they would have to recheck their traps every 24 hours just like everyone else. So it's an effort that I know a lot of people are behind. We've got this a very broad and diverse coalition of groups that includes Predator Defense, the Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, the Oregon Humane Society. There are so many people and organizations that understand that these devices are cruel and indiscriminate, and really, at the very least, the individuals that are putting the public and putting, you know, family pets at risk by putting these things out there, at the very least, they can check their traps every 24 hours. That's the very least we should be expecting of them.
Now, something else is the efforts to repeal, is it Measure 18? That
Right.
is the hound hunting of cougars.
Right. So in 1994, the voters passed Measure 19.
19?
I'm sorry, Measure 18. I was
Okay.
thinking 1994. Measure 18 in 1994, by a strong majority, banning the use of dogs to hunt bears and cougars and the use of bait to hunt bears.
So we're talking about 22 years ago.
Yes, and in virtually every legislative session since then, the trophy hunting lobby has been working with their allies in the Oregon legislature to try and weaken or repeal Measure 18. And this legislative session is no exception. There are 4 bills that have been introduced to basically allow counties to opt out of Measure 18. One of the bills actually sets a controlled hunt for cougars using dogs for sport. So, you know, it's terrible to think of our cougars being hunted for sport with dogs again, but it's also really disturbing that our legislature doesn't respect the wishes of the voters and are trying to second guess the value choice that was made by the voters of Oregon. So I was part of the campaign back in 1994 to get Measure 18 passed. I have been fighting for Oregon's cougars ever since then, and I will never stop. It is now, I think that the legislature, I'm hearing more and more legislators are starting to get fed up with these bills. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that these bills won't gain any traction this session as well.
Is there a tie between the sport hunting of cougars with hounds and predator control?
Well, it's interesting because the best available science on cougar management, and not just cougar management, but predator management, is showing us that these animals do best when they are left alone. The best cougar managers out there are the big, dominant, mature adult cougars who keep the rest of the population in check. When you increase hunting pressure on cougars, you create social chaos among the cougar population, and you take out a big dominant male, which is of course the individual that the trophy hunters want to take because it makes the best trophy. you create a vacuum, and all of the younger cougars are going to go in and scrap and fight to be the top cat. The losers of those battles are the ones that get pushed out to the margin, and those are the ones that are more likely to cause some sort of problem. So this is the kind of information that we're trying to give state wildlife managers, including the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, to let them know, if you want to measure the best available science, if you want your management decisions about cougars to be fully informed by the best available science, you need to start looking at what these scientists are saying, which is the more you hunt these animals, the more problems you create for people, for communities, for livestock. The best thing to do for these animals is to respect them and give them the space they need.
Is there anything that's pending federally or anything else in Oregon that animal advocates should be aware of?
One more thing in Oregon that I want to touch on, and then I think it's important to talk about some troubling federal developments. But there is also a process underway to rewrite the Oregon Wolf Management Plan. And for the first time, unfortunately, there is actually a proposal to start trophy hunting of wolves in Oregon. This is deeply troubling to, I think, to most Oregonians, the idea that our very small and vulnerable population of wolves could suddenly be targeted by the wealthy trophy hunters. We know that wolf hunting has brought out some of the most depraved cruelty imaginable in other states, where wolf hunters boast about killing these animals in the most painful, horrible ways they can because they enjoy seeing them suffer. And we don't want that mentality here in Oregon. And I have said that to the legislature, and I will say it every chance I get. Trophy hunting of wolves cannot be allowed to take place in Oregon. And I know that the majority of Oregonians agree with that and want these animals, just like cougars and bears and the rest of wildlife, to be treated with a fundamental level of respect.
And so how about federal legislation?
Right. So two disturbing and very troubling developments in the federal wildlife picture. First, the House of Representatives just passed House Joint Resolution 69, which allowed some of the most inhumane hunting methods available or imaginable on federal wildlife refuges in Alaska. These are federal wildlife refuges paid for by the American taxpayers, and under this new measure that was passed, hunters can now kill wolves and wolf pups in their dens, hibernating sow bears with their cubs, use great big leg hold traps to catch grizzly bears, shoot bears and wolves from helicopters and planes. The most unimaginably cruel and unethical hunting practices have been approved by the United States House of Representatives. It now goes to the Senate. But I would say that Oregon's Congressman Greg Walden, who is the congressman for this area, was the only member of the House delegation from Oregon to vote yes on that measure. And Congressman Walden does so much good work on so many other issues, but his constituents need to let him know that on wildlife he needs to do better. And voting yes on a measure that allows extreme cruelty to wildlife on federal lands is unacceptable. And so now we turn to the Senate, and we're hoping to get the measure stopped in the Senate.
Well, I'll certainly be making the call to Walden's office for sure about that. Thank you for that information.
One more thing before you let me go.
Yeah.
Republicans in Congress for the first time are talking about repealing or greatly weakening the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act since the late 1960s has been one of the strongest tools for protecting wildlife and preventing extinction. And there are so many success stories: bald eagles, grizzly bears, wolves. Right now Congress is actually talking about either tossing the Endangered Species Act completely or at least greatly weakening it and making it largely ineffective. So it's important for people to contact their United States senators and their representative and let them know, keep the Endangered Species Act intact, and let's keep saving these endangered species.
Well, we've got a lot of work to do as animal advocates, certainly under this administration, and I appreciate all that information.
You bet.
Great. We're now going to be watching a documentary called Exposed, and this is about wildlife services. Brooks Fahey from Predator Defense has has made it his life's work to try to disarm this branch of the USDA. And we're going to learn a lot about a lot of the concerns concerning wildlife services, and it will go in and do an in-depth look. So please join me now watching this compelling documentary. And thank you again, Scott.
My pleasure.
America's wildlife is a national treasure. Images of bears, elk, pronghorn antelope, wolves, coyotes, deer, and cougars inspire us with their natural beauty and majesty. Left alone, nature creates its own balance, with each and every species carrying out a vital role in this complex web of life. Today, this fragile web is under increasing pressure from human activities such as ranching, farming, logging, and development. When people move into wild habitats, conflicts arise between humans and wildlife. To mitigate these conflicts in the United States, the federal government created an agency under the United States Department of Agriculture, which is known today as Wildlife Services. This agency states on its website that its vision is to improve the coexistence of people and wildlife. However, its actual practices have led not to coexistence, but to the horrible deaths of millions of birds and mammals across the United States, as well as the brutal killing and maiming of thousands of pets. I first learned about wildlife services back in 1977 when I moved to Oregon. At the time, they were called Animal Damage Control. And I heard stories of aerial gunning of coyotes, trapping, poisoning of coyotes and other predators. And at first, I found some of these stories actually hard to believe. But then as time went on, I investigated these stories and I started actually having encounters with wildlife services agents. And I found that these stories were really just the tip of the iceberg. Where John is standing over here pointing, at the end of the measuring tape is where Fritz was caught and killed in the conibear trap, where Fritz's neck was broken in the trap. The deeper I looked into it, the more I saw that this was an agency that was basically running amok, was totally out of control, and seemed to have no authority to answer to.
Well, Wildlife Services is one of the most opaque and least accountable agencies that I know of in the federal government, outside of highly classified programs. Their expenditures, utilization of taxpayer dollars is even more opaque than the Pentagon, except for highly classified programs again. They're very good at stonewalling, ignoring congressional inquiries. They are a world unto themselves, and that's a world that we're not allowed to see into, even though they are taxpayer funded. They are supposedly acting in the public interest for public safety and for basically serious issues regarding predation on individuals or livestock potentially.
We called it the Wyoming Sting, and it was into the illegal use of pesticides, which brought us into the Wyoming State Department of Agriculture and Wildlife Services. There was work being done in Wyoming where eagles that had been poisoned were being located, and they were hard cases to make because of the remoteness of it, and people would not talk about it. It always seemed that the words eagles, coyotes, wolves led us to poisons and led us to Wildlife Services, or formerly known as Animal Damage Control.
So the government started having me buy these poisons from the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. So that's one of the head people over the Wyoming Department of Ag was selling me illegal pesticides that EPA thought had gotten destroyed after 1972. And he was selling that to me so that I could resell it to all the ranchers and the predator boards in the state of Wyoming in the western United States to kill coyotes and eagles or whatever predators, whatever problems they had. So as I got into this thing, finally they transferred Agent McKenna down to Laramie, and he moved down there, and him and I started working together. And we started buying just vast amounts of pesticides, thallium sulfate, compound 1080, strychnine, DDT, everything that had been banned since the 70s, and the records, official government records, showed that it no longer existed. We were actively buying it from the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. Now, the interesting thing about that is the Wyoming Department of Agriculture oversees and does all the pesticide inspections and all the M44 inspections that the Wildlife Services employees put out in Wyoming or any other state. Your Department of Agriculture actually oversees them. So in Wyoming, it was kind of unique because you've got the person that does the oversight. They're actively selling all the pesticides. It was like a big, huge drug operation.
Most state agricultural agencies, especially in the West, work very closely. They have almost an incestuous relationship with wildlife services. And that here you have the agency that's responsible for enforcing the use restrictions for sodium cyanide, strychnine, compound 1080, and yet they're violating the law themselves. So it really shines a light on there is no enforcement to the use of these deadly poisons by wildlife services. They're out there on their own. They do whatever they want. Our investigations show that over and over and over. And it's basically a free-for-all.
I was hunting mountain lions with 4 other employees. 2 of them was on the ground with me. 2 of them were in an airplane flying around looking for mountain lion tracks. The plane found 2 sets of tracks, and they followed the tracks and then radioed down to us, and we went on the snowmobiles in the direction of where the lions were headed. As we started up the mountain, one of the employees I was working with, his snowmobile stopped, and he said, well, I need to go up there, so you stay here with my broken down snowmobile and I'm going to take yours. So that's what happened. When they come back, they said they had killed 2 mountain lions, which was no problem. A few months later on, I was giving the gunner of the plane, I was giving him some instructions on snaring. And while we're riding in the truck, we got talking about those 2 lions, and he started laughing. He said, those 2 guys on the ground did not kill those 2 lions. He said, I shot them from the air. And I thought, holy cow, that's a felony. That's not right, that's a felony. And I'm a retired police officer. I worked 21 years as law enforcement, retired. I know, quite familiar with the law, and quite familiar that we're not supposed to be, as government employees, committing felonies or misdemeanors or any other type of crime on the taxpayers' money. So I didn't know what to do, but I knew a felony had been committed. The next time I talked to my supervisor, I didn't want anybody to get in trouble, but I wanted that to stop. I didn't want my fellow employees committing felonies. So I just told my supervisor about it. I said, listen, I don't want anybody to get in trouble, but you should talk to these guys and tell them that this is a felony, that they should not be doing it, and not to do it anymore. And up until that time, I was a great employee. When they had a coyote that needed getting killed and somebody else couldn't get it, they had me go in because they knew I could do it. And they always give me my reviews. Were always very good, excellent. And I was just a golden employee. Then after that, well, I told him that, and right off the bat, he got mad. And he said, you're a troublemaker. And I said, I am not a troublemaker. I don't want people to get arrested. If they get arrested and the public finds out about this, if it gets in the media, it's going to be a terrible black eye for wildlife services, a terrible black eye. We should not be out there as government employees committing felonies. But after that, he called me a troublemaker. After that, he was rude to me. Just completely different to me after that. I went from being a real good employee to being treated really good to being treated really bad. A few months after that, I get a letter from him saying that my job was being eliminated.
Well, there was really a vast array of illegal activities that I actually witnessed to when I was working for Wildlife Services, and then later on investigating them in the state of Wyoming in the western United States in the 1990s. When I was working for what we called animal damage control in those days, which is Wildlife Services, We had a large, different variety of violations, especially on the M44s. They really were putting no stake signs out, no entrance signs. They were keeping really bad records, no logs at all, with a second person having known locations on all those devices in case something happened to you when you're in the field. Mainly those violations on the M44s. Had a couple of instances where I was told by my supervisor for wildlife services that there was enough sodium cyanide in an M44 to kill up to about a 35-pound coyote. And on 2 different occasions, when I put devices out, when it was really dry, I killed 2 different calves that weighed over 250 pounds with my M44s that were licking the salt and stuff off of those units, and they pulled them, and they literally were laying dead within just a few feet of the units. And when I questioned him about it, and I asked him, and I told him, I said, I thought you said there was only enough cyanide to kill a 35-pound coyote, and we didn't have to worry about where we put them, and it wouldn't kill a human. He didn't really have a response to that. He just said, we just need to get rid of these. So we tied ropes onto them. We drug them off in the brush, and I was told that we were going to report them as kills by coyotes, and that's what we did. So we didn't take credit for any of that. So not only were we killing predators, we were actually killing the livestock that we were there to protect, which a coyote really couldn't have even killed a 250-pound calf to start with. But the fact that that's what I was told by my supervisor, and that's pretty well continued on with those practices on those kinds of things, on illegal activities. And, you know, we were constantly killing hawks and eagles and different raptors, and always we were told to do the 3 S's. We were told to shoot them, shut up, and bury them, you know. Shoot, shut up, and shovel.
In 2005, I was checking some snares. And I was had some snares set in a trail going down an arroyo. I checked the snares, and unfortunately I had snared an eagle, a golden eagle. He was caught by the neck, and he was dead. I went right to my truck, got my cell phone, called my supervisor, and said, I just snared an eagle, and he's dead in the snare. What do you want me to do? He said, has anybody seen it? And I said, I don't think so. I'm really remote here. I don't see any fresh tire tracks in the trail here. It's in heavy sagebrush, so I've dealt very seriously if anybody has seen it or knows that it's there. He said, well, if you think nobody saw it, take your shovel and go bury it.
And we were told to do that because it created job security for us. And it was very explicitly told to me that if I pissed off my rancher and I made my rancher unhappy, then my livelihood was going to end. The rancher had to be happy. He came foremost over everyone. So our record keeping was doctored according to making the rancher happy so that we could continue getting our government funding and we'd have no outside involvement in what we were doing. That was very important, and that was stressed to me from an early age when I first started with them.
I am not an animal rights activist. I'm not a wildlife advocate. I am a predator hunter, a predator trapper. I have been all my life. There's not many people on the face of the earth that's killed more coyotes than I have, but I do not believe that wildlife services and the federal government should be in the business of predator control. It should be run totally by the private sector, who can do a much better job, much more efficient, and less cost. The tax shouldn't be doing predator control on the taxpayer's dollar. When wildlife services, they arbitrarily go around killing coyotes. They just go kill coyotes, kill coyotes, kill coyotes, kill coyotes. They say we're killing target coyotes. Well, how do they know they're killing a target coyote? Does that coyote have a sign say, I'm a bad coyote? And then some of them have a bad coyote, and some of them have look up and say, okay, airplane, I'm a good coyote, don't kill me. When those aerial crews, when they see a coyote, they kill it. They don't know if it's a good coyote or a bad coyote. They're going to kill it. That's it. Wildlife Services does not have to abide by state fish and game laws. When one of their trappers goes and sets a trap, he can go a week, he can go 10 days, he can go 2 weeks, he can go a month and not check it. If I don't check mine every 24 hours, I'm in violation of the law and I will be subject to arrest by the game warden. Wildlife Services can go, they are not subject to arrest by game wardens.
Most states have minimum trap check times. And the reason for this is so animals won't languish in traps over extended periods of time. Wildlife Services is not required to, nor do they, check their traps on a regular basis. They can check their traps once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month. It's up to them and what time they have available. Here we have a case where a beautiful male coyote, 3 to 4 year old male coyote, was caught in a Wildlife Services trap. And it appeared to us that this animal had been in its trap from the extent of its injuries in the tissue for anywhere a week minimum, but possibly 2 weeks. As we investigated this situation and looked around, we found other coyote tracks within his area, right around him and in the snow around him. And what was interesting is it appeared to us that possibly his mate or another coyote was actually helping him survive, was actually protecting him against other predators, and probably bringing him food too. And I think this case demonstrates what we've been told by many, many Wildlife Services trappers, is that coyotes are just left in traps a lot of times until they just die. If the American public saw this and understood the brutality and the cruelty of this, that this program would be ended very quickly.
You've got to put a gate sign on the entrance to all your pastures so that anybody that would stumble into that area would have an idea that there are dangerous units in there. And we were told if we put that, then all we're doing is advertising for the environmentalists and the tree huggers and people like that to come in and mess with our units and to take pictures and to get us in trouble. So we were instructed not to put those signs on the gates, and we were told not to put the unit signs on the stake signs. So that way they felt like there's a better chance of them missing the unit by not having the legal signage up than by having it up. So therefore, that's why you're running into these situations where you've got people, they come up, they bend down, they see what appears to be a metal stake in the ground, they reach down and pull on it, and they've got an M44 going off in their face. They have no amyl nitrite, they have no anything with them that's going to help them or save them. If they're, the only way they'll survive it is if they're lucky enough that the wind was blowing away from their face and they don't get dermal injury on their hand or their arm or somewhere. That's the only way they'll survive it. And even at that, they could end up with permanent brain damage and things like that to them, so, and paralysis. So that was my biggest thing. I've always had a large respect for pesticides and poisons and things like that, and always tried to go by the rules. But the more I tried to go by the rules, the more problems that I had with my Wildlife Service supervisors.
And one great example of this is a case in Oregon that we got involved in where we went up. A dog had been killed, a beautiful German Shepherd mixed dog had been killed 100 yards from its backyard. This is an older dog. And we went up and investigated, and we found the M44 that killed the dog, which was still in the ground. And then we proceeded to find, with the help of children in the community, 5 other M44s that every one of them was illegally placed. They were all placed on a trail on a Christmas tree farm. And the farm had 2 or 3 main entrances to it, of which the gates were supposed to be clearly marked with warning signs that these devices were being used there, that they were deadly, and for the general public to be aware of it. Of course, Wildlife Services rarely puts up these signs because they don't want people tampering with these devices. They don't want people in the community to get upset that these devices are there. And they take the chance that nothing will happen and that they won't be discovered and that they'll be able to kill a bunch of coyotes and go along and nobody will know the better.
We had issues where we would accidentally kill household pets, dogs, and mainly dogs. And there were endangered species that also got killed, eagles, even buzzards, you know, which fall under the Migratory Game Bird Treaty Act. A lot of buzzards were killed. But specifically the household pets, when we caught those pets, we were told to take their collars off. We were told to get rid of the collars. We were told to bury the dogs, and we were told to never report that. That was a very standard practice that we were told all the way from the state supervisor, through the district supervisor, through our troubleshooters, and us. And that's what we did. That's what we were told to do, and that's what we did. So I was told to report by him to the city dump of Uvalde the next morning, which I did. When I got there, I found all of our Wildlife Service trappers there. My district supervisor was there, and also the animal control officer from the city of Uvalde drove up with a truckload of domestic dogs. And what I was told by my district supervisor, the reason we were there, we were field testing sodium cyanide capsules that have an expiration date on them, and once they expire, we're supposed to bury them and get rid of them and not use them anymore, because theoretically they're not supposed to still be good. But anyway, he proceeded to load the capsules into the capsule holder, set the ejectors, and he proceeded to get the animal control officer to bring the dogs over one at a time and hold them there and hold their mouth open, and my district supervisor took an M44 and he popped it in their mouth. And within about 30 seconds to a minute, the dog would start whining, you know, they'd start getting paralysis, they'd start dropping down in their hindquarters, they started hemorrhaging like from their nose and their mouth, and he'd let go of them and they'd fall over and they'd just be whining. You just tell they were in a lot of pain. They didn't know what was going on. You know, their eyes were rolling back. Then he would take the antidote that we carry in our top pocket, he would break it open and he would stick the amyl nitrate under their nose and sit there a minute and bring them back alive again. Then he would take another sodium cyanide capsule and again pop it in the same dog's mouth. Then the same dog would go through the same process, fall over, and then they would take and he just kicked them in the side and rolled them off into the garbage of the city dump down there, and they just laid down there hollering and whining until they died. There's 26 use restrictions on the M44. Nowhere in there does it ever give you permission to utilize those on domestic animals. As a matter of fact, it's a label violation under FIFRA. You know, it's so I guess that was kind of my turning point with animal damage control or wildlife services. I got so mad at my district supervisor and we got in such an argument out at the city dump that within a very short period of time, he gave me my walking papers. And I had nothing else to do with him after that. And I ended up having to leave the Uvalde district over what he was doing to the dogs. Now, had I not said anything and I would have actively participated in it, because he wanted me to and I refused to do it, I wouldn't do it. Because I've owned dogs my whole life, I love dogs. There's no way I would have ever treated an animal like that. And I thought to myself, it's amazing to me that we've got federal law that protects the public and our domestic animals and things like that, and these guys intentionally violate that law.
Wildlife services trappers will also oftentimes have dogs that they use to pursue animals, and they'll bring dogs out with them when they go to get animals out of trap lines. We found out about a case about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, where a wildlife services trapper had done just this. He'd been out with his dogs going along his trap line, and as he would find coyotes in traps, he would let his dogs loose on the coyotes. And now these are animals that are still alive. We found out about this because this wildlife services trapper posted over a dozen of these photographs on his Facebook page. And first of all, there's two things that are important about this. The fact that he didn't find anything wrong with posting this on his Facebook page, which I think demonstrates the culture of this agency. And second of all, that he was doing it to begin with, that what type of person does this type of thing? The closer we looked into it, we had found, and we've spoken to other wildlife services trappers about this. This is common. This is common practice. They say they do this to keep their dogs trained, to keep them trained for pursuing coyotes, because they also use dogs to just pursue coyotes and rip them apart, kill them. And so there was an investigation done that we were told was still being continued, and through recently discovered material, we found out that the investigation was concluded last December 2012, that they found that the wildlife services trapper had violated none of the directives, that he wasn't going to be fired or reprimanded whatsoever. He still works for the agency. And so obviously, these types of activities are still going on. The only thing Wildlife Services did was they clarified their directives a little, saying you shouldn't do this. But we all know they continue to do this. They will continue to do this. And I think it demonstrates how out of control this agency is. This is an agency that has completely run amok. They answer to no one. And it's been like that since its inception in 1931. They have been a rogue government agency, and they will continue to be a rogue government agency.
I've known trappers that do their own thing and they don't care. You know, they don't care what the policies are. And it's obvious to me that most of the top supervisors I've worked with, Wildlife Services, they had a total disregard for their own policy. It's not that they need a policy, they disregard the policies that they've got right now. And as long as we continue to fund them with our tax dollars and we keep them in business and they've got access to all these different other entities, the state ag departments, the Farm Bureau, the predator control boards, all the private ranchers that want a government handout versus doing their own predator control or hiring a person to do their own predator control, a private person that's trying to make a living, as long as we're funding this great, huge entity, then all these things are going to continue.
The one thing that I learned, and I learned the hard way from working with Wildlife Services, is that they lie from the top to the bottom. They lie. And why do they lie? What is their motive for lying? Their motive is, if the citizens of the United States knew what they were doing and how they were doing it, and the animals they were killing, and the non-target animals they were killing, the eagles that they were killing, the citizens would not stand for it, and they would be shut down in a heartbeat.
Where's the oversight?
Wildlife Services is not capable of reforming itself. They're going to need a mandate for reform. You know, I did once successfully limit their operations regarding lethal predator control. Amendment passed the House, but 2 days later, having gotten a number of the large agricultural groups hysterical in the interim and having them lobby their members of Congress, in a very rare vote, it was reversed. So they have powerful allies. They're essentially subsidizing corporate agriculture in addition to many of the bad things they're doing as an agency. And there just doesn't seem to be any will or impetus toward internal reform, so it's going to have to be imposed on them.
For over 50 years now, Wildlife Services has been criticized by some of the nation's leading wildlife scientists, by politicians, by conservationists, environmental organizations, by tax groups, and by Wildlife Services employees themselves. And I think what we're seeing is that this is an agency that is essentially beyond reform. It is so deeply entrenched in a philosophy and view that predators are vermin and need to be eradicated, that this is an agency that's simply beyond reform. And I think especially in this day and age where our tax dollars are so precious, that it's time to pull the plug on this program, that it is absolutely incapable of changing, and it's time for Congress to take action and end this wasteful program once and for all. Please visit predatordefense.org to learn more about Wildlife Services' secret war on wildlife.
Welcome back to the studio. We've just watched a compelling documentary laying out the issues with Wildlife Services. I'd like to turn our attention to what's going on locally. Wildlife Services operates in most Oregon counties. I've asked Sally Mackler, the Southern Oregon representative for Predator Defense, what the issues are locally under the contract Jackson County has with Wildlife Services. I've also asked her what people can do to support reforms locally, and here's what she has to say.
Well, first of all, I think the way that Wildlife Services is operating in Jackson County reflects the larger picture on how they operate nationwide, which is very clandestinely, lack of accountability, and complete lack of transparency. And I've noticed over the years in following this budget item and contract through the process and within the county that as a taxpayer and resident of this area, and I've lived here for over 24 years, the amount of information that I am able to receive is becoming less and less and less. And I do have a problem with that. Initially, there were quarterly reports that included several charts and actual information in letter format from the USDA Wildlife Services representative for the district area. Over the years, that has turned into a basic form letter with very little new information, perhaps a few new statistics plugged in. But other than that, it's been exactly the same. The information itself in terms of statistics and data has been reduced down to one small chart, which includes nothing but kill numbers and the species that are involved. There's no information about the methods used to kill the animals, where this took place, and what the purpose was for the, quote, removal, unquote, of these animals. For instance, was this because there was damage involved? Was this because there was a public safety concern? Was this a vineyard? Was this a commercial operation? Was this a private residence? None of this information is available. And in trying to contact the county representative directly or the Wildlife Service representative for the district directly, I am receiving less and less of that information now. And I think that the public should know that. We are all paying for this. This is a completely taxpayer-supported endeavor here. And I feel that service providers in our county should be held to a standard where they are required to provide regular reports that show what services they have provided so that taxpayers can see what they're getting for their money. So basically, I think we're not getting very much information at all from the county or from the state or from the federal government. And all of those funds, which for the last fiscal year that we have information from, which was 2015, or actually 2014, I believe, was a budget of about $83,000, somewhere in that nature, 3/4 of which were paid for out of taxpayers' general fund money. The rest of it was paid by state and federal funds, so it is completely supported by us as taxpayers. One thing that I think is also really important here is that there are no minimal husbandry standards that are required before lethal control or killing of an animal that may be bothersome to someone or a nuisance is removed. In other words, you can have a 2-foot chicken wire fence protecting or not protecting your livestock, which is basically out all night long, and that's not a problem. There's no requirement for the property owner to protect their animals or to provide any minimum standard of protection before the government will come in and kill public wildlife. And this is not educating anybody, and it's not solving the problem, because it will happen over and over and over again. You may remove one animal, but others will find an easy meal, and they do, and that's how they make a living. So it really is incumbent upon us to require that the property owner take some responsibility fiscally and ethically to protect their livestock and their property before we as government, before we as residents and taxpayers have to foot the bill to kill public wildlife for them. It's a private enterprise that is taking advantage of public resources without any conditions involved. What can the public do? the public, first off, needs to get educated, and one way that we can see that happen is by programs like this that will engage people and make them aware of this. My guess is that I would say 90% of the public is totally unaware that this program exists and that they are even paying for it, and many of those individuals would probably not be in agreement with this. Many people in this area feel less government is better. In this case, I certainly agree. Less government is certainly the road to take here. So people need to become aware of it. So one thing that we can all do is write letters to the editor. It's free. You can do that on your computer. It takes a second. You press a button and it reaches a lot of people. Everybody seems to be communicating through social media these days, which is a huge benefit for causes such as this to make people aware. And once they become aware, they can take that information and spread it out on their Facebook page. And each person then can do the same thing, which creates a large ripple effect and can really put some pressure on our county officials if we send the message correctly and tell people what to do and where to go. And we're going to provide you with some of that information so you will know who to contact and how to contact them and let your feelings be known about this.
As Sally mentioned, there are a number of ways to get involved. Contact your county commissioners. In Jackson County, that's Colleen Roberts, Rick Dyer, and Bob Strasser. And you can call for an end to the Wildlife Services contract, or at least at a minimum reforms to the contract. These reforms can include better oversight by the county, more transparency, better reporting, requiring property owners to employ good animal husbandry, and the requirement to use non-lethal methods. You can send letters or attend a weekly County Board of Commissioners meeting, write the Budget Committee, attend a Budget Committee hearing that will take place probably in April. Dates for those hearings will be on the county website in early April, as well as on the SOARS website. SOARS will also be sponsoring a protest around the time the Budget Committee meets. Check the SOARS website for that date. I encourage our viewers to become informed and make your opinions known about these serious issues. For more information, please visit the websites shown on your TV screen. This wraps up our program on human-wildlife conflicts. I'd like to thank our guests, Scott Beckstead. Thank you so much. I learned so much from our interview. And Sally Mackler and the staff and volunteers at RVTV for making this show possible. Animals Matter airs periodically on RVTV and monthly on KSKQ Radio, 89.5 in Ashland, 95.1 in Medford, or live stream at kskq.org on the fourth Wednesday of the month at 1 p.m. I'm Alyssa Weaver. Thanks for watching.